Well, hello and welcome. My name is Mark Epner. I'm a Chicago-based pilot with over half of my 2,000 plus hours in a Cirrus SR-22. Currently, I fly this 2011 normally aspirated G3, but also fly other aircraft when the opportunity presents itself. I love flying every bit as much as you do and look for ways to share that common bond through multiple paths, including this channel, as well as Simple Flight Radio, which you can find at simpleflight.net. My goal for the channel is to share my passion for aviation with others that share that same sentiment and do so with an eye towards proficiency, safety, and fun.
Mayday, mayday, mayday. Cirrus 973 Sierra Delta, engine loss, north of Mansfield, circling for off-airport landing.
Sierra Delta, this is Skywest 5747. You said 73 Sierra Delta. Where, how far north of Mansfield?
Last calling Mayday, say again.
Cirrus 973 Sierra Delta just had an engine blowout, and I don't know how far north of Mansfield, but I'm landing on a field here.
Okay, 73 Sierra Delta, I'll hand it on to ATC Jimmy.
973 Sierra Delta, we'll pass that information as well to ATC. Fly the airplane all the way to the ground.
Wilco, coming close to the ground now. You're safe. Nice job. Good job. Nicely done.
Good job. Attaboy.
Well, hello and welcome. I can't believe it's been a year and a half since my catastrophic engine failure in my SR-22. I made two videos back then. The first described what happened and how I reacted, and the second was all the things that happened in the ensuing 4 to 5 hours after the plane was safely on the ground. I have links to those videos below. But one question remains unanswered until now. That question is why? Why did my engine decide to blow apart? And then, of course, the follow-up question that pilots always ask, that being, could it have been prevented? Now, I've known about the cause for over a year now, but as we were involved in connecting the dots, doing our due diligence, we wanted this to come to its natural conclusion. And in the spirit of respect for all those that touched this incident, it was important to be patient and ensure the facts were confirmed. Well, today I go public. But please note, the purpose of this video is to tell you what happened and why. I have no interest in pointing fingers or placing blame. Therefore, you may find some of my statements missing interpretation, maybe lacking a little clarity. So by presenting only relevant facts, my hope is you will find value from an educational perspective. So with that in mind, let's get into it. Well, after the engine issue, we sent the engine to Continental, the manufacturer of our IO550-N model that was in the SR-22, to conduct a forensic analysis on what happened and, of course, why. Then, to appease those that might feel Continental had a vested interest in the outcome of the analysis, we then sent the engine to an objective third-party shop to see if they came up with the same conclusion. And they did. As it was ultimately explained to me, our engines have huge amounts of pressure, which we all know. And in a sense, though, they're trying to break themselves apart. Now, you think about it, a combustion engine has fuel, air, explosions, lots of moving metal. So there's a lot going on there, but they do their job as long as the integrity of the engine remains intact and temperatures and pressures are within specs. Not unlike an aviation accident being the result of a chain of events, our engine was victim to a chain of events as well, starting with some minor discrepancy that caused a bearing to shift. The report I received was 19 pages of high-res pictures and a description for each. The report outlined the parts of the engine that exhibited normal operating signatures and those that did not. I've left out all of the non-relevant data and pictures. While it was interesting, I felt it would unnecessarily elongate the video. So as for why the engine experienced the catastrophic failure, the summary explained, and let me read it to you. The inspection of the engine revealed the number 2 main bearing had shifted to the rear of the engine. The bearing was fragmented on the edge and blocked the oil feed to the number 2 connecting rod. The number 2 rod overheated and released from the crankshaft. The released connecting rod exited through the top of the crankcase, striking the magnetos and fracturing the mounts on both magnetos. The crankcase exhibited lock slot elongation and fretting on the parting surface of the number 2 main bearing saddle. The remainder of the main bearing supports exhibited normal operating signatures. The engine exhibited mechanical damage to the internal components of the engine from the release connecting rod. The oil filter exhibited metal contamination from the damaged components. The oil filter had 26.8 hours since installation. A breakaway torque check was completed on the engine at disassembly. The chart at the end of this report are the results of this torque check. So as you can see, the number 2 main bearing showed the fretting as it shifted position. As it moved backward, it covered the oil supply hole, which prevented the oil from getting to the connecting rod. As we all know, oil is the lifeblood of an engine. Compare this to the number 1 bearing. You see no fretting, no movement, no covered oil hole. As soon as the oil feed was cut off from the number 2 bearing, the engine didn't stand a chance. Now this happened over time. The cylinders were worked on approximately 61 hours prior to the engine failure. The oil was changed approximately 27 hours prior. I purposely am leaving the torque values off. And the reason is, for the untrained like myself, there is a need to understand what the numbers mean and how they compare to documented specs, which were not part of the analysis documentation. I felt it would end up asking more questions than it answered, so I left it off. So the remaining question is, could this have been prevented or avoided? Knowing the oil starvation was the result of the bearing shifting, the focus has to be on what caused the bearing to shift. Was it maintenance-induced or was it due to natural causes? If the result of maintenance, was it a torque issue or improper stretching of the bolt? Was the required process not followed? As an owner-operator, it would be tough to know all of those things when the engine is not in my sight, and therefore, I don't think I could have anticipated or prevented the in-flight failure of the engine. But I know this, despite my interest and research into the engine and proper maintenance procedures, I'm going to take it to a new and next level going forward. For example, when the recent AD came out on new and factory remanned engines from Continental, and that required an inspection of 2 cylinders. Well, because it impacted my new engine, I flew down to the shop that was going to do the inspection, and I had an in-depth conversation with the shop manager to discuss how the inspection would be completed and how that compared to the manufacturer recommended procedures and known best practices. It's not 100% guarantee that everything's going to be great, but at least we were all in agreement on the approach and process and communication. The last question I suspect that is on your mind is, what was the process like over the last 18 months? From the time the airplane was removed from that field till now, what happened? Well, I can tell you it wasn't always a pleasant process and there was some difficult conversations, but it was educational. And even though there was essentially no damage to the plane, the pilot, or property, the costs were not insignificant. Certainly much less than if there was damage to the plane, or if the chute had been pulled, or if there had been a major injury or fatality. But there still were significant costs associated with the removal of the airplane from the field and transportation to the maintenance facility. Insurance premiums went up, and while the airplane was in maintenance, I had to rent other airplanes at a higher hourly cost than what I normally charge myself. There was additional maintenance costs, administration costs, and loss of value. So without going into specifics, let me just state, should you find yourself in a similar situation, be anal about documenting all of those costs. Now, there was a pleasant surprise, and that was with working with the insurance adjuster. I love the professional partnership that developed. I did my homework as to what the process should be, but in the end, it came down to 2 human beings working together. I found this insurance adjuster to be very professional, and we both worked to take the emotion out of the situation and stick to being reasonable. And that helped us to get to a mutually agreeable place. I wouldn't necessarily call it a win-win, but I felt like all parties ended up in a reasonable place. And maybe that's the best we can ask for. So as I look back, I think I learned a lot about all that has happened since that April day in 2022. I learned about empowering ourselves as PICs to best handle an engine out emergency through study, training, and practice. I learned what happened after the incident in terms of the actions to take, the cost, the emotion, and the expectations of things to come. And finally, I learned about the insurance process, the process to involve other stakeholders to help determine the best course to take, whether it be through a forensic analysis of the engine, the process to get the plane back in the air, the process to get the pilot back in the air, which also, by the way, included rebuilding confidence to that pilot. In this case, I had in general aviation airplanes, and quite honestly, that I had in myself. It was a process. So my goal and my hope is between today's video and the two previous ones, they've helped to impart that knowledge to you as well. I love this community because we all learn from each other. So please, let's continue the conversation. Let me know if you have any other questions. And as always, blue skies and tailwinds.